Nadine Campbell, and this is the History of Musical Theatre podcast. Welcome to episode 4, George Balanchine and Tamara Geva. I've decided to break up the Balanchine years by wife, or, de facto wife. Those who know, I won't give it away just yet. This is for a couple of reasons. Firstly, Balanchine lived for a long time and worked for all of it. Secondly, because of the large scope of this season, I need to break it up so that I have time to talk about the ballets themselves as well as the Broadway shows people are doing. And thirdly, because his choreography was largely shaped by his muse at the time, and he married his muses. So who was George Balanchine? He was regarded as the foremost contemporary choreographer in the world of ballet, at least in the words of the biography on his own website. I'm going to steal the introduction from George Balanchine, the ballet maker, because it beautifully summarizes the context into which Balanchine was born. George Balanchine was born in St. Petersburg, the year after Marius Petipa created his last ballet at the Mariinsky Imperial Theatre, and the year before Mikhail Fokine created his first. It was the year in which Isadora Duncan made her first appearance in Russia, encouraging Fokine and others in their impulse toward change. And within the next 5 years, the Russian exodus to the west had begun. Pavlova to her eternal touring, Diaghilev with his Ballet Russe to Paris, with Nijinsky and Karsavina in tow. Okay, so I basically summarized what I did in 3 episodes in 3 sentences. The Balanchines, I'm just going to call them the Balanchines. My Russian is not up to the challenge. Were from Georgia, not the state, the country. His father was a respected folk musician and a widower, whose second wife was mother to George, along with his brother Andrei and sister Tamara. His mother, Maria, was less than half of his father Meliton's age when they married, but they seemed happy. Meliton was generally unconcerned with money, not because he was extraordinarily wealthy, but he just was temperamentally not bothered whether he had it or not. This did lead to him, at one point, being charged with willful bankruptcy after winning a large sum of money and then spending it all and giving a lot of it away and getting himself back into debt. The family's relative status, combined with their bouts of relative poverty, left state education as the best option for the family. This was offered for the army, the navy, as well as for actors and dancers. It wasn't uncommon for high-status yet poor families to send their children into these schools. The family's status would be retained, but the child's room and board and education would be covered by the government. Navy school was Balanchine's first choice, but he'd actually missed that year's intake. His sister Tamara was applying for the Imperial Ballet School. A comment from the auditioner led to George being sent in to audition. He left home in the morning expecting to go to Navy school and came home with a future at the Imperial Ballet School. At this point, he'd never seen a ballet. This brings us to an interesting historicity point. Balanchine lied, or maybe embellished, or maybe didn't remember some of his own history. It's very possible that Balanchine's acceptance into the Imperial Ballet School may have been related to his father's connections as a musician. We've seen a couple of examples of this kind of light nepotism/connectivism in school admissions before. The system screened for talent, but connections always helped. My autocorrect also just gave me an option for connectivism as a word now, so that happened. In the years between Balanchine being born in 1904 and him being accepted into the Imperial Ballet School in 1913, there are a couple of important births. In 1907, Tamara Jiva and Lincoln Kirsten are born on opposite sides of the world. In 1911, Eugene Loring is born. The same year George joined the school, Ray Weimer is born in Chicago. For George, the first year at ballet school was pretty miserable. If you've ever studied ballet, you know that the foundations can be pretty awkward and boring. As an adult, I'm able to see the end goal. Pliés and tendus are tolerated and eventually enjoyed because you understand how it strengthens your body and prepares you for jumps and turns and crazy high extensions and for point work. All of that comes from this basic classwork. But if you're a young boy who's never seen a ballet, outside of class, his life socially was also reasonably dismal. On weekends, George was mostly alone at the school. Most of the students would return home for 2 days to see their families, but the Balanchines lived far from the city, so the young boy stayed at the school, using their time to play the piano in the empty hall. One of the things that would later define Balanchine as a choreographer was his understanding of the scores he was using. Next episode, you'll hear a little bit about his ballet Concerto Barocco, which is a pretty perfect example of this. When the other students were around, George still didn't have friends around him. He earned the nickname Rat because of the tick which showed off his large teeth and his somewhat standoffish nature. In his second year, he came to love ballet. It was in his second year that he got the chance to perform in The Sleeping Beauty as a tiny little Cupid. It was a bit part in the Petipa version of the ballet. He'd be in a lot of Petipa ballets over the course of his time at the Imperial Ballet School. Don Quixote and the Nutcracker were two examples of this. He'd actually steal a lot of the Russian ballet Nutcracker for his own version later in America. He'd also appeared in operas presented by the Marinsky's operatic counterpart. Over the next 2 years, Vera Zorina and Jerome Robbins are born. The former will get episode 6 as her namesake, and the latter got an episode last season. We'll also talk about him a lot this season. I promise next season will be almost entirely Jerome Robbins free, I think. In 1918, Balanchine's family, who'd moved briefly to where George lived in St. Petersburg, moved again further away. He would never see them again. He is 14 at the time. Their moving was reasonably understandable in the context of the Russian Revolution. There was actually a year when the school and the company were both closed. If you can believe it, it was suggested that ballet was an extravagant, lavish, bourgeois art form. If this was a visual medium, I would include here the most bourgeois ballet photographs I can find. Think 40 dancers on stage, glittery tutus, the whole shebang. The Russian ballet pre-Russian Revolution was even more extravagant than the contemporary Russian ballet, which is pretty much seen as the height of lavish, extravagant ballet. Someone eventually suggested that the proletariat might enjoy ballet, so the company reopened. But it was not as it had been. The theatre had no heating, and the frozen water burst the pipes, filling the studios with water. Dancers were constantly sick. But it wasn't just the cold, and it wasn't just at the ballet. Of those years, Danilova, the year ahead of Balanchine at the Imperial Ballet School, said sometimes we were given horse feed. The horses, meanwhile, were dropping dead in the streets. During the night, people would come out with knives and take whatever they could from the carcasses. In the morning, there would only be bones. She probably said it with a Russian accent, though. St. Petersburg had been renamed Petrograd, and in 1919, Balanchine began to study music at the Petrograd Conservatory of Music. Yes, on top of his ballet studies. 3 significant events happened in 1920. Future dancer and choreographer Joan Bailey is born. Balanchine creates his first work, La Nuit, or The Night. It's a pas de deux for him and a female student. Danilova described it as sexy, and it featured risky and experimental one-arm lifts. These kind of lifts would become pretty common in the Balanchine repertory. Thirdly, Lincoln Kirsten, who we will talk way more about in the future. He makes such a brief appearance in this episode, but there's more on Lincoln Kirsten. He saw his first ballet. Like so many, he saw Anna Pavlova on one of her eternal tours in Boston. He was 12, and it will be crazy influential on his life. The next year, Balanchine joins the Marinsky/State Theatre of Opera and Ballet. The Soviets gave cool things dumb names. He really had more of the makings of a character dancer than a danseur noble. He had an impressive jump, striking, if not strictly handsome features, and really crisp musicality. His version of the hoop dance, which would later be renamed Candy Canes in the American version of the Nutcracker, was pretty famous. His entry into the professional world marked the end of his studies at the Petrograd Conservatory. Balancing both proved impossible, and he didn't graduate. But this doesn't mean that his time there was spent in vain. He studied piano, harmony, counterpoint, composition, as well as a little violin, French horn, drums, and trumpet. The value of this education would be seen throughout his works, and when we get to talking in a little bit more detail about the ballets themselves, this is going to become so obvious. In 1923, Balanchine marries his first wife, Tamara Jiva. Tamara studied ballet privately and then joined the night classes at the theatre school of Soviet ballet. She didn't come up in the system like Balanchine, but she was a reasonably talented dancer. Her family's roots were Muslim, but their business was in manufacturing objects for the Russian Orthodox Church. Her parents, Livko and Tamara, were unable to marry until she turned 6. Her mother was frequently unfaithful throughout their marriage. Their home had in it a miniature theatre and a theatre museum, and is now the State Museum of Theatre and Music, a place you can still visit. They lived in a large apartment, and Balanchine moved in with the family some time before marrying Tamara. Now, there are 2 accounts of their agreeing to marry, one from Tamara and one from George. According to Tamara, her father said, "Why don't you get married? I mean, it's obvious that you are crazy about each other. Whether it's puppy love or real love, doesn't matter. Time will settle that. If you find out it was a mistake, you can always get a divorce. Meanwhile, I would feel easier if you were married." Now, that is some terrible marriage advice right there, but Balanchine took him up on the offer, both in terms of the marriage and the divorce, but we'll get there. Balanchine's own account of the event is completely different, saying Levko never demanded anything of him but Wagner. I personally prefer to believe the first one, and there are some corroborating accounts. This year marked a significant increase in choreographing for Balanchine. It seems like his earliest work had made an impact on his peers because he was consistently being asked to choreograph anything and everything. This eventually turned into a small, experimental company, a kind of secret mini company within the State Theatre, called the Young Ballet. It was made up of Balanchine, his new wife, Tamara Jiva, his old girlfriend, Mangalova, his future girlfriend, Alexandra Danilova, alongside Lydia Ivanova, Pyotr Gusiev, and Nikolai Efimov. If you're wondering, the pattern of once and future girlfriends being part of the company will continue forever. One piece from this company was a dance set to rhythmic recitations of Russian limericks. I am so sad that this piece is lost because I love a good comedic ballet. The company didn't really make much money, or almost any, but it did garner attention. Some of it was positive. Balanchine ended up on the cover of the magazine Theatre, for example, but there was also negative attention from important people, like at the Mariinsky. The company were brought in and told in no uncertain terms that if they continued to work with Balanchine, they would be fired. For Balanchine, he was fired right off the bat. 1923 may have seen the end of the Young Ballet, but it didn't end Balanchine's choreographic aspirations. For the former members of the Young Ballet, the constant mild starvation was making relieving Russia a real priority. A friend of Balanchine's, the singer and croupier of a gambling club, had some significant government contacts. Through him, they were able to get permission to take a group of dancers to Western Europe, at their own expense. The group was called the Soviet Dancers, and included George, Tamara, Alexandra, Lydia Ivanova, and Nicholas Efimov. And Nicholas Efimov. Russian names are so hard. Except they didn't all go. Lydia Ivanova died shortly before they left in a suspicious boating accident. There was reason to believe she was close to some members of the secret police. You could not call it an understatement to say they were all relieved to arrive in Germany. The show was not popular in Germany. It was for unknown Russian dancers, with only piano accompaniment and less than lavish sets and costumes. Nevertheless, when a letter came requesting them all return to Russia, no one except Danilova was remotely interested in complying. She was slated to perform Kitri in Don Quixote in the following season. If you want to get a sense of that role, I recommend going to Marinsky soloist Maira Khoreva's channel on YouTube. She has some great clips of her performing the role, and her cardio bar is exceptional. Off topic, but amazing class. I will link her performing some key tree in the description. When the contracts came for the London season, Alexandra agreed to forego key tree and stay with the Soviet dancers. Short term, wrong choice. Long term, I'd say it was the right choice. In London, they performed in a variety show, After a Dog Act. Their limited English and the strict time constraints in the music halls led to the group being fired 2 weeks in. They found themselves in such financial straits that Tamara sold her hair to a wig maker. Now that's some Les Mis level poverty. What happens next is that they join the Diaghilev Ballet Russe. But there is both a Jiva and a Danilovo account of how this came about. Firstly, the Jiva version. Having lost their job, their visas were set to expire, and the only place that was going to allow them to stay was France. So off to Paris. There they are, in their Paris hotel room, discussing their next steps. They suggest they could travel to Monte Carlo and audition for the Ballet Russe. That's when they received a call from Serge Diaghilev, who had heard of their show in London, tracked them to Paris, and wanted them all to audition the next day. I feel like the silly voice might give away a little bit who I believe in this situation. The Danilova version was a little different. In her account, the first contact with Diaghilev came in London, and it was he who asked them to come to Paris to audition and paid for that travel. I don't know which account is true, but I'm inclined to believe Alexandra. The next year, they joined the Ballet Russe. Diaghilev needed someone to take over choreography for the opera ballets required by his contract for the casino in Monte Carlo. Balanchine promised he could produce them quickly. He taught a little choreography to some Ballet Russe dancers, and, to quote, "Thus it happened that at the age of 20, Georgy Melontonovich Balanchine, or George Balanchine, as he would henceforth be known, found himself ballet master of the most famous and remarkable ballet company in the world. But before he got the chance to create ballets, he had to start with opera ballets. At the time, opera ballet choreography was pretty dreary for dancers and for choreographers, but Balanchine threw himself into the work. Using his music school score analysis, he was able to create some really remarkable stuff. It was also the first time that he had a quarter ballet to work with, and they really enjoyed the new, challenging choreography. Balanchine proved himself so much that at the company, in 1925, he was given the chance to create L'Enfant et le Sortilège for the ballet company, using a score he would return to time and time again, as well as Le Chant de Rossignol for the new baby ballerina Alicia Markova, or Alicia Marks before her name was Russified. In a few weeks, I'm probably going to be interviewing someone very cool to talk about this ballet, so keep your eye or your ear, keep an ear out for that. Balanchine also sometimes danced with the company, though reports on his actual dancing varied from, quote, wonderful to, quote, terrible. Tamara Geva spent some of this year away from the Ballet Russe, playing Oberon in a German production of A Midsummer Night's Dream. The New York City Ballet will have a lot of crossover ballet and theatre stars, and Tamara will be one of the first. This year, Maria Tallchief and Nora White, both future New York City ballet dancers, are born. The years at the Ballet Russe had a pattern to them. New creations in Monte Carlo, then a season there and seasons in London and Paris. The relationship between Diaghilev and Balanchine, though, was a bit contentious. The majority of the successful Ballet Russe repertoire at this point was Balanchine's work. As it is put in George Balanchine, the ballet maker, autocrats are not always grateful to underlings who appear to be indispensable. If George was indispensable, Tamara was somewhat more dispensable, quoting again, She was a talented dancer, but not on the level of Danilova or the other ballerinas, and Diaghilev made it clear that he had no big plans for her. This divide was also seen in their relationship. As is so often the case, there are multiple accounts of this. George says Jiva was moving away from their Russian roots. She spoke German and French and had interests beyond him. Quoting again, "And then I thought, time to end all this." Tamara and Alexandra provided a different account of the split. Danilova recounted Balanchine coming to her room, massaging and kissing her feet. I feel the need to point out here that ballerina feet are always kind of gross. For context, Danilova, understandably confused, asked around what was going on with Balanchine. She was given the advice, ask him. I did. Ask again. So she did. I love you. What about Tamara? Well, I don't love her. Tamara Jiva was deeply hurt by this, by both of them, but she wasn't going to stay where she wasn't loved. Jiva heard that the musical revue Swahili was looking for performers, particularly Russians, and with their marriage in tatters, she left to join the touring show. Swahili was created by Nikita Belyaev, an Armenian actor who came via Russia. He'd been a member of Stanislavski's Moscow Art Theatre before leaving for what he was more passionate about, comedy. He started The Bat, a revue comedy group, stealing its name from the popular Viennese cabaret Fleur de Masse. This lasted until the Russian Revolution, when the group up and left for Paris, because, Russia kind of sucked. With a new French name, Swahili, still The Bat. I bet you didn't think you'd come out of this knowing incorrect pronunciation for the word for bat in 2 new languages. The things we learn here, people. Our producer saw the show in Paris and brought it to London, then more tours, and finally Broadway. 1922 Swahili on Broadway is kind of a fascinating story. It ran from February to June at the 49th Street Theatre, then June to October at the Century Grove. A new version of the show was then presented from October to January, and then a new version January to May. Then they moved to Jolson's 59th Street Theatre for a September run. And all of this was choreographed by Kochevsky, Bronislava Nijinsky's sometime husband. Nikita Belyaev hosts the show with a signature mix of English, French, and Russian, playing up his poor English for the stage and using a lot of gestures for words he didn't know. Tamara joined the 1926-27 version of the show, with 3 new solos choreographed for her by Balanchine. In spite of the hurt she felt from being essentially replaced, she was proud to be the first person to bring Balanchine choreography to America. 1927 had 2 other important events. Lincoln Kirsten founds a literary magazine, Hound and Horn, and George Balanchine injures his knee while dancing and has unsuccessful surgery. His dancing career is all but brought to an end. He will perform sporadically over the coming years, but he is now a choreographer and not a dancer. Next week, you'll get to hear an interview with an English dance teacher and Billy Elliot ballet master, Dilly Greasley. She also gives the world's hardest ballet class. And then after that, we have the Danilova years. I hope you enjoyed. Keep dancing.